Mr. Biggs, Ranking Member Jayapal, I am honored to have the opportunity to testify before you, the members, and the subcommittee. Who said you can never go home again? I began working for the subcommittee in 1995, became Chief Republican Counsel in 1998, and served in that capacity until 2018. While on the committee, I worked under 4 extraordinary chairmen, and I worked with extraordinary colleagues, none more so than Andrea Loving. As the Ninth Circuit has explained beginning in 1980, Congress introduced a series of bills to address its concerns with extended voluntary departure and to provide a more formal and orderly mechanism for group-based grants of humanitarian protection, eventually culminating in the 1990 enactment of temporary protected status. Extended voluntary departure is blanket immigration relief for all members of a national group. And the former chairman of this subcommittee, Romano Mazzoli, in 1988 described it as having only the shakiest of legislative foundations without any statutory criteria. Congress created TPS for 3 reasons. First, to provide immigration relief to many thousands of illegal aliens from El Salvador. Second, in the words of Judiciary Committee ranking Republican at the time, Hamilton Fish, because there was then no clear statutory relief available providing temporary protection for reasons unrelated to persecution. And third, because as subcommittee chairman at the time, Bruce Morrison said, the executive branch had created EVD out of whole cloth, and there ought to be a statutory structure. At a 1999 hearing of this subcommittee on this subject, Chairman Lamar Smith said, the question is not whether TPS should be granted. In many instances, it should be. The question is whether it is really temporary and to what extent TPS invites fraud. That is the lens through which I view TPS. Congressional advocates at the time were careful to emphasize that TPS would, 1, convey a purely temporary status, and 2, require beneficiaries to leave once their country's designation was terminated. House Democrat Whip William Gray said, we are not asking that they be allowed to live indefinitely in the country. Chairman Mazzoli said, the aliens must return home unless TPS status is extended. And he said that beneficiaries will be identified so that when they can safely return home, we can enforce the laws with respect to them. Representative Joe Moakley said, I have heard it said that if we enact TPS, the people covered will stay here forever. But assured members that I am certain that many, if not most, dream of the day that they can return to the land where they were born, and that a substantial majority will return voluntarily, and this bill provides a mechanism to ensure this result. In fact, the Judiciary Committee report criticized EVD in contrast to temporary protected status because, quote, INS cannot effectuate the deportation of aliens whose EVD status has expired. At the subcommittee's 1999 hearing, my colleague, Mark Krikorian, testified that TPS would simply be a lie if it were used as a backdoor to permanent immigration, but predicted that few, if any, Hondurans or Nicaraguans currently covered by TPS will ever depart voluntarily or be removed. These fears were certainly prescient. Last year, the Pew Research Center concluded that some TPS beneficiaries have lived in the U.S. for 2 decades or more. In fact, under the law, periodically following a TPS designation, DHS shall determine whether the conditions for such designation continue to be met. If it determines that a country no longer continues to meet the conditions for designation, DHS shall terminate the designation. Otherwise, DHS shall extend the designation. The Biden administration's extension of El Salvador's designation earlier this year demonstrates why a country can remain designated for so long. DHS did not believe that present-day adverse conditions have to bear any relationship to the original qualifying event, such as a quarter-century-old earthquake. But DHS did believe that non-optimal climactic conditions were sufficient, even with no expectation of change in anyone's lifetime. In fact, Leon Rodriguez, the Obama administration's USCIS director, said that intervening factors were relevant regardless of whether they had any connection to the event that formed the basis for the original designation. TPS needs to be reformed, and I thank you for the privilege of testifying.